The empire once ruled the seas. Its ships carried power, pride, and promises of endless wealth. But empires do not fall only to enemy fire. Sometimes they collapse under the weight of their own choices. This is the story of how victory came at a terrible price. A price paid not in medals or maps, but in debt, hunger, and broken futures. The empire once ruled the seas. Its ships carried power, pride, and promises of endless wealth. But empires do not fall only to enemy fire. Sometimes they collapse under the weight of their own choices. This is the story of how victory came at a terrible price. A price paid not in medals or maps, but in debt, hunger, and broken futures. The war was never paid for in full. It was postponed, deferred, pushed forward into years that had not yet arrived. Each day of fighting was bought with tomorrow's stability. Each moment of survival came at the expense of a future that no one could see clearly anymore. In government offices, time itself became currency. Officials spoke of months, not years, of extensions, not repayment. The idea was simple. Win first, pay later. Victory would solve everything. Victory would make the numbers disappear. It always had before. Or so they believed. On paper, the nation still looked strong. The currency still circulated. Wages were still paid. But beneath the surface, the clock was ticking. Interest accumulated quietly, like water rising behind a dam. No alarm sounded. No warnings reached the streets. Only those closest to the numbers understood how narrow the margin had become. Every shipment that crossed the Atlantic carried more than weapons and food. It carried obligation, the cost of transport, the cost of protection, the cost of dependence. Britain was no longer just fighting enemies. It was racing against the weight of its own promises. In shipyards, workers labored through exhaustion. Hands cracked, backs bent. Overtime blurred into routine. They were told they were building victory. Few realized they were also building debt. Each vessel launched carried pride, and a price that would echo long after the war ended. Families adapted again and again. Savings were spent. Heirlooms sold quietly. Plans delayed without explanation. A generation learned to live without certainty, to accept that comfort was temporary, that normal life was something to be restored later, always later. The empire survived by stretching itself thinner than ever before. What could not be produced was purchased. What could not be purchased was borrowed. And what could not be borrowed was promised. The future became a silent guarantor, signing contracts without consent. Across negotiating tables, allies spoke the language of necessity. Support came with terms. Access came with expectations. Influence shifted subtly, not through conquest, but through leverage. Each agreement tightened the web. Each favor moved the balance. Soldiers on the front line sensed none of this. They counted days, not debts. They fought to endure the next hour, the next push, the next night. Yet their endurance depended on supply lines sustained by money that no longer truly belonged to the present. Back home, inflation softened the edges of sacrifice until it became routine. Prices rose without announcement. Wages followed slowly, if at all. People adjusted, believing this was simply the cost of survival. Few recognized it as a loan taken out against their own future. The nation continued forward because stopping felt unthinkable, because retreat would collapse confidence, because confidence itself had become the final weapon. As long as belief held, the system survived, and so Britain moved ahead, one borrowed day at a time. The battlefield was no longer defined by maps alone. It extended into offices, vaults, and meeting rooms where no shots were fired, yet outcomes were decided. Here, war was reduced to calculations, columns of cost, lines of risk, lives translated into figures that fit neatly on a page. Decisions arrived with urgency, not because of enemy movement, but because funding was running out. A delay in payment could stall a factory. A stalled factory could starve a front line. A starved front line could collapse an entire campaign. Strategy bent quietly to solvency. Men in uniform waited for orders shaped by numbers they would never see. An advance postponed, a retreat disguised as redeployment, not due to weakness of will, but weakness of reserves. Ammunition rationed not by tactical restraint, but by affordability. Even bravery had a budget. Inside government chambers, the language of war softened into the language of finance. Discussions avoided emotion. They spoke of sustainability, of acceptable loss, of thresholds that could not be crossed without consequence. Every life spared or spent had an economic shadow attached to it. A general argued for reinforcements. A minister asked about cost. The silence that followed said more than words. Victory was no longer just about defeating the enemy. It was about staying liquid long enough to claim success, to remain credible, to remain standing. On the home front, production targets replaced hope. Workers were pushed beyond endurance because slowing down meant falling behind financially. Overtime became patriotic duty. Fatigue became invisible. The human body turned into another resource to be consumed efficiently. The war demanded choices that felt wrong even as they felt necessary. Funding a campaign here meant abandoning one there. Protecting a route meant exposing another, not because of strategy, but because the numbers refused to stretch any further. Every choice closed a door somewhere else. Civilians sensed the shift without understanding it. Supplies disappeared without explanation. Promises were revised. News grew vague. People felt the tightening long before they saw its cause. They learned that silence often followed questions about why certain things could no longer be done. Behind sealed doors, leaders confronted a truth they could not share: that the war's direction was increasingly guided by what could be afforded, not what was ideal. That some operations existed only on paper because the resources to execute them no longer existed in reality. Money did not care about morale. It did not respond to speeches or sacrifice. It obeyed its own logic. When it ran thin, it forced restraint. It forced compromise. It forced a reckoning that no amount of courage could override. Soldiers continued to fight with full belief, unaware that the scope of their struggle had already been narrowed. That the war they imagined and the war being financed were no longer the same. That somewhere far away pens had already decided how much longer this could continue. Debt did not arrive with drums or banners. It slipped in quietly, wearing the mask of necessity. A signature here, a promise there. It never demanded attention. It only asked for patience. And patience in wartime was always available. Inflation followed just as silently. Prices changed overnight without explanation. Bread weighed the same but cost more. Coal burned the same but drained pockets faster. People noticed, then adjusted, then stopped noticing altogether. That was how it worked. The danger was never sudden. It was gradual enough to feel normal. In crowded streets, shopkeepers erased numbers from chalkboards and wrote new ones with steady hands. Apologies were offered softly. Customers nodded, pretending not to feel the shift. Coins lingered longer in palms before being spent. Every purchase became a decision. Every decision carried quiet anxiety. Savings lost meaning first. Money set aside for peace dissolved into survival. Years of discipline vanished without ceremony. What had once represented safety now bought only a few more weeks of comfort. The future was being consumed, one small transaction at a time. In offices and factories, wages rose slowly, if at all. Paydays arrived with less relief than before. Workers felt it in their bones before they understood it in numbers. Longer hours were needed to maintain the same life. Fatigue became constant. Complaints became rare. There was no energy left for either. The government spoke of stability, of control, of temporary measures. But inflation does not retreat easily once invited in. It reshapes behavior. It changes trust. People stop believing that money will hold its value tomorrow, so they spend it today. Scarcity feeds itself. Debt, meanwhile, grew heavier with each passing month. Interest did not care about sacrifice or suffering. It accumulated relentlessly. Payments meant to secure survival began to limit choice. Funds meant for recovery were diverted to service obligations made years earlier under pressure and fear. Ordinary citizens felt the squeeze without ever seeing the source. Ration lines lengthened. Quality declined. Substitutions became routine. A nation learned to accept less and call it resilience. Pride filled the space where abundance once lived. In quieter moments, doubt crept in, not about the war itself, but about what it was doing to life beyond the battlefield. Parents wondered what kind of world their children would inherit. Workers wondered if effort still led anywhere. The answers never came clearly. Debt and inflation worked together, unseen but unstoppable. One demanded future payment. The other eroded present stability. Together they reshaped the economy without ever announcing themselves. No enemy could be named. No victory could defeat them. By the time their presence was fully understood, they were already embedded in daily life, in habits, in expectations, in the uneasy sense that something fundamental had shifted and that returning to what once was would require more than peace alone. The war spoke loudly at the front, but at home it whispered. It whispered in kitchens before dawn, where hands reached for ration books instead of choice, in queues that stretched down streets once busy with laughter, in the quiet pause before a mother decided which child would eat more that night and which would be told tomorrow. No medals were given here, no speeches made. Civilians learned the language of absence, empty shelves, missing letters, delayed pay, promises that arrived late or not at all. The war entered homes not as an explosion, but as a slow rearranging of life. Factories demanded more, always more. Shifts extended, days blurred together. Men and women worked until exhaustion stopped feeling temporary. The body became currency. Strength was spent because money no longer stretched far enough. Rest felt like a luxury the nation could not afford. Children grew up early. They understood scarcity before comfort. They watched adults calculate constantly, measuring food, coal, and hope with the same careful attention. Playgrounds fell silent sooner in the evenings. Childhood bent under responsibility. In crowded rooms, radios delivered distant updates. Victories announced in confident tones. Losses softened by language. But the sound that followed was not celebration. It was calculation. How long until prices rise again? How much longer until the next delivery? How many weeks until winter? The burden did not fall evenly. Those with savings saw them dissolve quietly. Those without learned to endure without complaint. Pride kept many silent. Asking for help felt like failure. Suffering became private, carried with dignity because there was no alternative. Women carried double weight, at work by day, at home by night, managing scarcity like strategy, stretching meals, repairing clothes beyond recognition, holding families together while the world outside demanded endless sacrifice. Their labor went uncounted, but without it, nothing functioned. Old routines disappeared, Sunday dinners grew simpler, holidays passed without celebration, life was reduced to essentials, anything beyond survival felt indulgent, the future was postponed indefinitely, grief arrived without warning, a telegram, a knock, a silence that lingered long after words were spoken, yet even loss had to fit into schedules. Work resumed, lines were waited in, the system did not pause for mourning, the war asked civilians to give without limit, time, labor, comfort, certainty, and when nothing more could be given, it asked for patience, to believe that this suffering had meaning, that it would be remembered, that it would be repaid. But as months turned into years, a quiet realization began to form, that while battles were fought far away, the cost was being paid here, slowly, daily, in ways too ordinary to be recorded, yet too heavy to escape. Paper replaced abundance. Thin, stamped, numbered pages decided who ate and who waited. Ration books became passports to survival, guarded carefully, worn soft at the edges by constant use. They were proof of entitlement, but not of sufficiency. They promised fairness, not fullness. Mornings began with calculation. How much bread remained? How many meals could still be stretched from what little was left? Butter was measured with care usually reserved for medicine. Meat became a memory spoken of more than tasted. Hunger was not dramatic. It was steady, patient, always present. Queues formed before sunrise. People stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, coats pulled tight, breath visible in the cold air. No one complained loudly. Complaints wasted energy. Eyes stayed forward. Everyone knew the routine. Wait, hope, accept whatever was available. Be grateful it was something. Children learned the rules early. No seconds. No waste. Plates were cleaned not out of discipline, but necessity. Questions about why things were different were answered softly, or not at all. Adults carried explanations like burdens they could not put down. Shops looked familiar but felt changed. Shelves were barer. Substitutes replaced staples. Names on labels mattered less than calories. The ritual of buying food lost its comfort. It became transactional, urgent, devoid of pleasure. Clothing followed the same path. Fabric was reused until it thinned beyond recognition. Shoes were repaired again and again. Style disappeared. Utility ruled. Appearance mattered less than endurance. Looking worn became normal. Looking new felt suspicious. Energy was conserved everywhere. Lights dimmed earlier. Rooms went unheated. Families gathered in smaller spaces to share warmth. Cold seeped into bones and stayed there. Winter felt longer, harder, less forgiving. Labor filled the hours hunger could not. Long shifts dulled the body and quieted the mind. Work distracted from emptiness. Exhaustion made sleep easier even when meals were small. Productivity became a coping mechanism. Letters from the front arrived irregularly, sometimes hopeful, sometimes brief, sometimes final. They were read carefully, folded neatly, and stored close. News of loss did not stop the routines. Grief learned to coexist with obligation. The language of sacrifice filled the air, posters, broadcasts, speeches. Everyone was told they were doing their part. That restraint was strength. That endurance was victory. The words helped. Sometimes. Other times they felt thin. As months passed, patience wore down quietly. Not into rebellion, but into weariness. People stopped imagining abundance returning quickly. They stopped planning celebrations. They stopped expecting ease. Life narrowed to essentials, and even those felt fragile. Hunger was no longer an emergency. It was a condition. The most important battles were never announced. They took place far from the front in rooms without windows where voices were low and decisions carried no applause. Maps were replaced by contracts, uniforms by suits. The stakes were no less severe. Britain arrived at these tables not as a conqueror, but as a petitioner, powerful still but stretched thin. Its requests were framed as partnerships, as cooperation, as necessity. Help now, settle later, trust us. The words sounded confident. The reality was fragile. Across polished surfaces, pens paused before touching paper. Questions were asked carefully. How long would the war last? What guarantees existed? What influence would follow repayment? Every answer shaped the price of survival. Nothing was given freely. Everything carried weight. These loans were not just money. They were leverage. Each agreement subtly redrew lines of influence. Control shifted without flags changing hands. Sovereignty did not vanish. It diluted, slowly, quietly, one concession at a time. The public never saw the details. They were shielded from the language of dependency. Speeches spoke of unity, of shared purpose, of unbreakable alliances. But behind the language of friendship lived obligation. And obligation always demands repayment. Resources followed the money. Decisions followed the resources. What could be produced at home was no longer enough. Supply routes grew longer. Reliance deepened. Independence narrowed. Survival required access, and access required agreement. Inside the halls of power, unease settled in. Not fear of defeat, but fear of exposure, that the nation's strength now depended on external confidence, that a single refusal could unravel months of planning. Pride learned to coexist with necessity. Soldiers never knew whose signatures secured their ammunition. Civilians never knew which distant conversations determined what arrived in their shops. The effects were felt, but the causes remained invisible. That was the design. Dependence works best when unseen. Each loan bought time, but time came at a cost beyond interest. It altered posture, tone, authority. Requests replaced commands. Negotiation replaced assumption. The empire adjusted, even if it never admitted it had. Some agreements extended beyond finance, access to markets, future preferences. Strategic considerations postponed, not erased. The war demanded urgency, and urgency pushed tomorrow's questions aside. But they waited, patient, unforgiving. As obligations accumulated, freedom of movement narrowed. Choices that once felt sovereign now required consultation. Nothing dramatic, nothing explicit, just enough to feel the shift. Just enough to change the balance. The empire still spoke with confidence, still projected strength, still stood tall in public view, but beneath the surface it was bound by invisible threads, tied carefully in moments of desperation, each knot pulled tight by necessity, each one shaping a future that no longer belonged entirely to itself. Victory came with banners and guns, but its cost was invisible. Factories hummed with relentless energy, machines pounding steel into shapes of war. Every bolt, every beam, every crate carried more than material. It carried the exhaustion of those who built it, the debt of a nation too proud to pause. Ships launched into harbors with fanfare, yet the applause never reached the docks. Workers' hands were raw, eyes red from smoke. Fatigue draped over them like a heavy cloak. They celebrated quietly, knowing the metal they shaped would last longer than their strength. And still, they returned the next day, always back. On the streets, life continued under a fragile rhythm. Shops reopened, markets moved slowly, prices shifted almost imperceptibly. People adjusted, adapted, smiled when needed, worried when necessary. The city breathed with careful restraint. as if aware of its own vulnerability. Every step, a reminder that prosperity was borrowed. Soldiers returned from the front, or they did not return at all. Those who survived walked home through streets lined with shadows, carrying stories that could not be spoken aloud. Their uniforms were tattered, their spirits tested. Yet they found families waiting, faces hopeful, unaware that the weight of survival was heavier than any weapon they had carried. Debts written in ledgers far from the streets pressed on everything. Payments arrived silently, hidden in agreements and obligations. Nations that once looked to Britain for leadership now watched carefully, aware of cracks invisible to the casual eye. Influence was measured in ability to act, not history or reputation. Every decision carried a price unspoken. Homes reflected restraint, meals were simpler, fires burned shorter, clothes patched and repatched. Children learned patience and calculation, counting coal and bread as naturally as numbers on a page. Play became quiet, laughter measured. Generations were shaped by limitation as much as by hope. Across the empire, the machinery of war still moved. Decisions at the highest levels dictated who would fight, where, and for how long. But each choice bore the imprint of exhaustion, of cost, of limits imposed by what could be afforded rather than what was strategically ideal. Ambition collided with reality in silent, relentless ways. Even as victories were claimed abroad, the foundation at home shifted beneath them. Factories that had supplied the front began to falter under wear. Laborers grew older and thinner, not in years alone, but in vitality. Money no longer stretched far enough to cover dreams. Security became provisional, comfort, a memory. The empire's victories were real, they were celebrated, they were chronicled. Yet beneath the flags and fanfare, tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Every triumph carried a hidden toll. Every parade masked the strain of survival. Every cheer echoed quietly against empty wallets and tired hands. The nation had won, yes, but the foundation beneath that victory was quietly fraying. The streets were quiet, but the weight of war lingered in every corner. Windows reflected dim light. Smoke rose from chimneys carrying the smell of coal and rationed meals. Britain stood tall, victorious, yet its breath was shallow, as if the nation were holding something it could not release. Money, once a symbol of certainty, now felt fragile. Banks that had once lent freely to the world now scrutinized every request. Foreign lenders whispered conditions with polite smiles. Every loan carried expectation. Every agreement left the empire bound, not by chains, but by obligation. Power remained, but it was tethered to promises that would never fully expire. Soldiers returned home to a country unfamiliar in subtle ways. Factories still roared, but fewer hands tended them. Streets seemed emptier, not from absence of people, but from absence of vitality. Savings had eroded. Wages had not kept pace. The cost of war had been paid, yes, but the currency was not counted in coins or notes. It had been counted in time, in stamina, in futures lost before they were lived. Families adjusted in silence. Kitchens felt smaller. Rooms grew colder. Meals became quiet exercises in calculation. Children learned to measure not only food, but hope. Play shrank into corners. Laughter was softer. Adults spoke in numbers more than in dreams. Every decision, how to spend, how to save, what to forgo, felt like a negotiation with survival itself. Governments, celebrated abroad for strategy and success, wrestled with ledgers behind closed doors. Ministries debated how much could be afforded before instability spread. Choices were dictated less by principle or vision, and more by what the treasury allowed. Victory abroad had come at a cost invisible to the eye, but palpable in every delay, every ration, every careful step taken by those who survived. In quiet neighborhoods, shadows carried stories of sacrifice. People who had given all returned to a home that demanded more. Shops sold less. Work demanded more. Energy and optimism were commodities measured more strictly than coal or flour. The nation had survived, but survival left its mark. The machinery of government and commerce carried on, but it groaned under pressure. Long after the guns fell silent, schedules remained tight. Production quotas were relentless, supply chains fragile. The war may have ended, but the economic strain was not a temporary guest. It was a permanent resident. Citizens understood in fragments, in small moments of quiet reflection. A mother balancing coins in her hand, a clerk watching the ledger grow ever longer, a worker noticing that pay could not stretch as it once did. The empire had triumphed, yes, but it had traded certainty for endurance, ease for vigilance, freedom for promises that would demand repayment for generations. Even in victory there was a tension, a quiet reminder that triumph had not erased consequence. Every street, every home, every hand that built, cooked, cleaned, or labored carried the invisible weight of a nation that had fought bravely, but at a price that stretched far beyond the battlefield. The parades ended, but the streets did not feel lighter. Confetti lay in wet patches on cobblestones. Flags drooped in the winter wind. Victory had been declared loudly, but the silence that followed carried its own weight. People walked home with proud faces, yet their steps were measured, careful, unsure. Homes that had survived bombing and rationing now faced another kind of hardship. The cost of triumph had returned quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the form of higher taxes, limited goods, and a scarcity that no one had anticipated. The empire's strength was visible on banners and medals, but invisible in pockets and pantries. Families learned to stretch what remained. Bread was still measured, coal was still rationed. Children grew accustomed to nights without warmth. Adults grew accustomed to anxiety disguised as routine. Daily life became a series of careful calculations, each one informed by what had already been spent, borrowed, or promised. The war had left no battlefield behind. It had simply moved into kitchens and living rooms. In offices across the nation, clerks worked late into the night. Ledgers were endless, columns unrelenting. Every pound owed demanded attention. Every promise made during desperate months had to be honored, repaid, or renegotiated. The nation was rich in victory, but poor in freedom. Every decision had a cost that stretched beyond the ledger, beyond comprehension, beyond comfort. The children of returning soldiers stared at the faces of parents changed by the front and the home front alike. Fathers returned tired, haunted by orders and numbers, mothers worn from sacrifice that never appeared in headlines. The stories of heroism abroad were visible. The quiet endurance at home remained invisible, yet both had the same weight. Both had demanded the same price. Even the streets reflected the tension. Factories roared, but fewer workers remained to tend them. Shops opened, but inventory was fragile. The hum of commerce returned, but it carried exhaustion in every note, in every echo of labor. Victory had not restored ease. It had revealed the fragility that had always been there. Public speeches celebrated resilience, unity, and triumph. Citizens nodded politely, yet knew better. They had lived through sacrifice that could not be undone. They had labored for victory that would be measured not in gold, but in weeks of rationing, months of uncertainty, and years of rebuilding. Triumph had a cost, and it was now being tallied quietly in every home. Even as the empire projected confidence abroad, a subtle strain threaded through every decision. Governments had to balance ambition with limitation. Banks had to approve more cautiously. Allies watched, waiting to see if Britain's economy would wobble under the invisible weight of debt and deferred promises. Every action carried a hidden pressure, a quiet check on pride. Citizens sensed it without naming it. Conversations lingered on prices, shortages, and work. People watched each other's faces for signs of strain. They understood that the war had ended, but its shadow had not. The celebration had passed, leaving only the echo of responsibility. The empire remained strong, yet fragile. Its banners flew high, its soldiers returned. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet tension persisted. Every hand that had labored, every mind that had calculated, every family that had endured now carried a reminder. Victory had arrived, but so had the reckoning.